is an ongoing debate about the seeming pointlessness of games. I've wrestled with this debate personally myself, namely the idea that something so engaging could be a monumental waste of time. Now, of course, the experience of it being a monumental waste of time often depends on whether I have achieved some arbitrary goal that I set for myself or that some arbitrary goal set for me by the developer which I've taken it upon myself to attempt to achieve. Anyway, I've also fielded this complaint from students I've had in regards to philosophy. They might say something like, "Well, this is all entertaining, but please tell me what I need to know to get the grade that I want on the test that you are assigning to me." I've personally made additional goals for myself also that would make my other desires seem less lofty. For instance, at one point towards the start of the pandemic, I made a proposal to my church to conduct a men's Bible study in a virtual world. I suggested EVE Online, thinking that it would be a way to meet without having to unnecessarily risk contamination because of the virus and all that kind of stuff. I never heard anything back, and to be honest, I think my proposal was more selfishly motivated than anything else. I wanted a way to play EVE Online, or EVE, and still tell myself that I was being a productive, good member of society. I am no longer, however, suffering from such self doubts, but it's still not clear to me whether or not I should be. But there are two lines of thought in this area, namely that video games are a waste of time, or that they achieve no other real purpose than, say, popular entertainment. And a part of the reason is the manufacture of artificial goals. However, these goals often enable alternate modes of being, which is an argument that Tywin makes. For instance, absorption, which can give rise to other experiences like frustration, isolation, invention, or epiphany. I I created my own goals by proposing the men's Bible study. But the real artificial goals at the center of the debate are those goals derived from the game's developer. In order for a player to play a given game, they must adopt the goals given them by the game's developer. For instance, in the game's sign, participants must be able to communicate a deep truth to one another using a completely arbitrary and made up language. Deviating from the rules set by the developer will prevent the player from being able to participate in that particular activity. And so, like I said, I've wrestled with this idea for years afterward, that our lives would become more imaginative, creative, with the majority of our time traversing virtual worlds, in wherein there are arbitrary goals that we pursue, and physical worlds where maybe the goals are arbitrary and maybe they are real. For instance, making a meal so that I don't starve to death. But much later in life, the pandemic happened, or much later in the past, remember the pandemic, shortly before that, I discovered a new genre of video game, namely Space Sims. These included games like Elite Dangerous, Star Citizen, and EVE Online. At first, I only had the computational ability to play EVE Online and Elite Dangerous, but and also, more importantly, I was never particularly any good. In part, this was because I was more interested in experiencing not only the visual effects of the game's environment, but the expansive way in which they manufacture and manipulated human relationships or enhanced human relationships. For instance, at one point in EVE Online, I was brave enough to venture into the LoSec. I lasted not even 3 minutes before another human being spawned at my location and obliterated my character. It was a significant setback, and I remember very vividly the fear that I felt at that time, the disappointment concerning my decision to venture into LoSec, and my feeling of loss for having lost all of the items that I had at the time, which I carried with me into LoSec. It was such a noob mood. Even now, it is difficult for me to separate, the feelings that I had in that moment from imagined feelings of standing, say, on the side of a highway with an out of control car barreling toward me. Uh, I felt helplessness, confusion, and it was all for a game. Importantly, Wynn argues that these alternative modes of being uh, are only made possible when we commit ourselves to the game, or by adopting its rules and ensuring that we pursue what would otherwise be an arbitrary goal. Uh, but we might think that here we've found a way to mitigate the seeming pointlessness of the activity. The goals give rise to the other experiences that I had, such as disappointment, fear, confusion, and maybe some exhilaration. Uh, my current game, the one that I play currently, is Star Citizen. Now, Star Citizen is another space sim, as I mentioned before, but it is currently under development by its company, its parent company, CAIG, Cloud Emporium Gaming. A developer's stated goals, for instance, Chris Roberts, aren't always very clear, and sometimes they change, and it's not clear exactly what the ultimate goal is. But they are incredibly ambitious, and I think that one way to look at the ambitiousness of the project is to understand that the goals aren't clearly stated. Oftentimes in life, we don't really have clear goals at the outset. So, for instance, when a person gets married, do they have a clear goal in regards to their marriage? Are they saying something like, well, we want to stay married at least for 30 years? I don't think so. Maybe they are, but typically the goals aren't as clearly stated. It's more just like we really enjoy each other. And so they get married as a way of telling others how much they enjoy each other. That's not really a goal. And it could be said that Star Citizen is a similar activity. What's your goal? I enjoy making this world. So, Star Citizen, what's important about this is that it is crowdfunded. And I think that if it were, say, a publicly traded company or even a private corporate company whose stated goal is profit, I'm not sure that it would do as well. Part of the reason is that it's been in development for the past 12 years or something like that. Now, but like that could be wrong too, because and this is why. So Star Citizen is a crowd-funded endeavor, and but today, even more importantly, it has raised close to $800 million, more than significantly more than any other entertainment franchise ever in the history of entertainment franchises. So the money earned from Star Citizen has generally been through the sale of in-game items such as ships and armor and ships components and blah blah blah. And so while players and this has also led to a lot of criticism of the game. Um, but anyway, so while players can use credits earned in the game for various ship and ship component purchases and the like, ships purchased through the pledge store come with lifetime warranties, meaning that the purchaser will always possess them regarding of how many times they are destroyed. Now, this is an important concept because the game's architect, or well, founder, Chris Roberts, has stated more than once, or has brought up the idea more than once, that they intend to develop an in-game feature or a mode of play known as Death of a Spaceman. And so, like, the idea with Death of a Spaceman is that a player has a character, they spend money or maybe credits or time leveling this player up, developing certain skills of this player, that those skills can then be used to conduct in various activities that are the choice of the player. But most importantly, when we think of this skilling and leveling up, the more that a player obtain skills in one area, and this was really important in Eve Online too. The more they obtain skills in one area, the more difficult it makes it for them to operate in other roles, in other methods of being. So, for instance, and I'll explain what that means in just a little bit. But in regards to the death of Spaceman, the idea is that after so many deaths, the player's character will die, and the player will have to develop a completely new character from scratch. And here they'll have to re-earn all of the ships that they had, and the ship's components and armor and whatever else that can be obtained through gameplay. And some people have criticized this idea because they're worried that they would get attached to the character, and becoming attached to the character, there would be a sense of loss were they to lose that character. And we've seen this in other games where people have become attached to their characters, and then because of the game's mechanics and some mistake that they made, or some you know co- co- coming across a more skilled player or something like that, they lose that character. And so, what's significant about this is the fact that here we've given the player a better job or a better ability to more fully engage a given agency, and also more importantly, this agency is something that's developed through the actions of the player. And so here's another example along those lines. So I currently belong to a large in-game organization, shortened to org. And there are quite a few orgs in Star Citizen, and these orgs are largely player generated, and so they are a collection of individuals who come together and they agree on a kind of or a mode of play. And so there are engineering orgs and dogfighting orgs, and then there are industry orgs and military orgs, so on and so forth. Pirate organizations, what have you, PvP, whatever, right? So in the organization that I belong to, we actually have quite a few roles, and quite a few potential roles that a player joining the org could choose to conduct gameplay within a given role. And so there are primarily two sets of roles. There are military roles, and then there are civilian roles. And of course, the military roles protect the civilian roles during various industry operations, such as mining for mineral and ore. At such conducting such activities at which the industry personnel would typically be very vulnerable to attack and to griefing and things like that, or salvaging ships that have been destroyed due to combat. So if they're in an active combat zone and they're trying to salvage a ship that had just been destroyed, then the military roles can conduct operations to protect those individuals. The military roles here also conduct operations in the game that aim to make the game quote unquote safe for even non-org members. And this is special because even games like Star Citizen often have a number of what are typically called griefers, and these are individuals who have had a significant level of skill or have adopted a significant level of skill, maybe through many hours of intense gameplay and the like, and they often use that skill to make progress for less skilled players difficult or or impossible, sorry. In part, it was these kinds of activities that
What are you doing?
caused significant headaches for instance, the developers of Eve Online. At one point, it was practically impossible for newer players to become established enough to make gameplay interesting for them. And without new players, it was significantly impossible for Eve to experience any sort of continued growth. So our org in Star Citizen has taken it upon themselves to organize collective gameplay at various times with the sole intent or the sole purpose of protecting areas of lucrative activities, say an asteroid field that is ripe with minerals that could be mined. And they protect these areas from like griefers and other kinds of pirates. Now, our org gives names to these roles and responsibilities, and they include names like trading, mining, salvage, marines, navy, competition, engineering, to name but a few. And what these what these names, these terms signify are the types of activity that a player wants to conduct during the game. So additionally, one has to complete, now even more special, within the org and not necessarily in the game itself, an individual has to complete training for a given role in order to deserve or to justify being given that designation, such as miner or trader or Navy pilot or Marine gunner, what have you. And also, and this is also something within the org itself, but it occurs in game. In order to borrow money from the org's collective bank, an individual also has to complete training, whether as a Marine or a Navy pilot, what have you. And so they have to borrow, in order to borrow money from the corporation's bank or the organization's bank, to buy larger ships and weapons and other component upgrades, they have to complete training. And so these are arbitrary goals, but they are significantly layered or complexly layered goals. And each of these, the roles and the rules for borrowing credits and death of a spaceman, etc., may seem arbitrary on the surface, but more importantly, there is a significant distinction between the goals provided by the developer and those provided by the player. Even more importantly here, the developer does not create rules, does not create the rules necessarily, but rather they create an environment, or they create environmental constraints, and these constraints could be thought of as rules, but they're not rules in the agential sense. They're more just like environmental constraints or laws, say for instance physical laws of space, for instance. They can include things like centrifugal force, that if a player learns how to operate within those laws, they could become, say, for instance, a better dogfighter, sorry. And so the player needs to learn to recognize and manipulate these laws and rules in order to develop her own rules, such as the proper method of gameplay or the proper salute when beginning PvP with another player. And so, just for your information, the proper salute, I think it's something like this, but two ships fly to a distance of, say, 6 kilometers away from each other, and then they face each other, and then they can see the distance they are from the other individual, because it'll be represented on their character's halo screen. And so once they've determined that the proper distance away from each other and they're now facing each other, they're going to fly towards each other at a fairly high rate of speed, turning the underbelly of their ship toward the other person as they pass them. And so these are rules that are created by players, and some are spoken, some are unspoken. Like, for instance, the proper salute is an unspoken rule that's created by players, and CIG has nothing to do with it. I assume they don't. but it's not a mechanic built into the game itself, but rather this is a mechanic that players have adopted for one another and they've taught it to each other. And so when we think, like what's important about this is that this is a prime example of the ways in which video games constitute an aesthetic experience. And this is what Wynn would say, and Star Citizen is an example of this. It is an experience predicated upon the perception afforded to the player. The question that remains is what is the relationship between the player's agency here, the newfound agency, and the aesthetics experience. For instance, could the aesthetic experience be had without the enhanced agency provided by the developer? And I'm going to say that Wynn is going to say yes, it can be, because ultimately, when we think about this agency, it's there are varying degrees of complex agency. So a game like Monopoly may not give or may not afford the player as much agency as a game like Elite Dangerous or Star Citizen or some other kind of simulator type game. And so, or like a game, a platform game, a platformer game, and may not afford as much agency to the player as something like, say, Dungeons and Dragons, for instance. Anyway, so I hoped you enjoyed this, and if you, and so tell me what you think. What do you think about your experiences and your experiences of agency in games like Star Citizen? Let me know in the chat.